With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yoma Daf Lamed Aleph. We are continuing to learn the sugya as we had in the Mishnah yesterday, that Ein Adam Nichnas La'azara La'avoida Afilu Tahor Ache Yitboil. Everyone needed to go to the mikveh prior to entering the Azara. We spoke out to Rashi, even though the Mishnah uses the words la'avoida, it means both a kohen to do the avoida, but lav dafka, anyone who entered needed to go to the mikveh. And then the Gemara brought the Braisa with the machlokes tanoim as to the reason, which is very important. So Ben Zoyma holds that this tefillah is midoiraisa, as he learned it from a Kal V'chomer. Right, remember, Hamashana Mikoidish Lakoidish, the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, he has to go to the mikvah, so certainly Michaela Lakoidish, etc. And the Tana, Rebbe Yehuda, holds that this tefillah is called Sirach Tefillah. Sirach Tefillah means it's a reminder immersion. We are hoping that if the person became tamei and they forgot about it, now that they are commanded to go to the mikveh, they're going to maybe chap, oi, I'm tamei, and then indeed they won't go into the azara, but it's a tefillah midrabanan, and we're going to continue to focus on the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. So yesterday we were learning about, according to Rabbi Yehuda, since it's only midrabanan, are we b'chal concerned about chatzitza? And we concluded yesterday's shiur that when we go to the mikveh, like today, Tfilas Ezra, it's only a minig, then we're not concerned with chatzitza. But whenever there is an obligation to go to the mikveh, even if it's only midrabanan, then yes, that rule is called the takon rabbanan ke'ein doiraisa takon. We're going to continue to focus b'shitas Rabbi Yehuda about the concept of bia b'mikzas, partial entry. We're going to quickly review when we learn inside the whole concept of a mitzayra, that a mitzayra only has a partial entry, and do you need to go to the mikveh even for only a partial entry? We're going to be learning on Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph regarding the spring known as the Ein Eitam. Now the Ein Eitam, as we'll learn in Rashi, is the highest point in Eretz Yisrael, from which comes out a spring of living waters. And it was from those waters, eventually they made themselves to the temple complex. They filled up the mikveh that the Kohen Gadol used. And this is simply a scientific and natural phenomena, that in order for you to get water without a pump into a high platform, into a mikveh that's high up, the source of the water has to be at least a little bit higher for the water to go up to its source, because without a machine, the water is not going to go up to a place that's higher from where it came from. So we're going to figure out exactly what is the height of the Ein Eitam vis-a-vis the second story in the temple complex where we had the mikveh that the Kohen Gadol used. Now on Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, we're going to go mamish through the steps of the avodah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. And where we're going to spend the rest of the Amid will be on the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim in the following. Every time the Kohen Gadol went to the mikveh, he needed to be mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim prior post. Every time he went to the mikveh, he needed to wash his hands and his feet by the kier before and after. But don't forget, it's not just about going to the mikveh. He needed to remove his clothing, go to the mikveh, and then he needed to put on his new clothing, whether he's putting on his big day zahav, whether he's putting on his big day lavan. So the machlokes between Ameir and the Chachamim is, when exactly was the Kohen mekadesh his yodayim v'raglayim prior to going to the mikveh? Was it before he took off his clothing, or was it after he took off his clothing? And we will see the amazing nafkamina between it. At the end of the day, there were 10 times that the Kohen Gadol was mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim, and we're going to have to cheshbon both l'Rav Meir and l'Rabbanan exactly when did those 10 kiddushim happen. As we'll learn, that l'chu'ura, the first time was not before going to the mikvah, because the Kohen Gadol began the day wearing big day choil. And as we'll see, it's really going to be a machlokes tanoim, whether the Kohen Gadol needed to be mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim, connected to the removing of his big day choil. And we're going to learn much more, but chavra, let us start on the Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph. We left off 2 lines from the top of the Amud. Again, we are focusing. You go over there on the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that going to the mikveh is a midrabanan, and now based on that, Amalei Abayel Rabbi Yosef bia b'miksa shma bia oiloi. Now partial entry is exactly what the mitzvah needs to do. As we spoke out, that there's like a catch-22. Before you bring your karbanis, if you are a mechusar kippurim, then you have to, you can't enter the Azara. But in order for the karbanos of the Mitzayra, for it to be brought, you can't just bring it for him. Some of the dam of the asham, as well as the oil that came along with the asham, has to be applied on his body, for which he would stand by the boundary between, so to say, out of Machna Shechina to inside Machna Shechina, which is in the doorway of Shad Niknar, and he would insert his ear, he would insert his thumb, and insert his toe, and on it you would smear the blood and the oil. So the question is since the whole Tefilla is only midrabanan, compounded with the fact that the Mitzayra is not fully entering. After they bring the karbanis, he's going to want to fully enter. That there's no debate that for that he has to go to the mikveh, according to the shita of our Mishnah Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, that the tefillah is only midrabanan, to only have a biyah b'mikzas, which is what the Mitzayra needs to do prior for him having the blood and the oil smeared on his body parts, does he have to go to the mikveh for that? Now really, that is exactly the braises that we learned about yesterday. So Amalei, to which Rabbi Yosef responds to Abaye, no, for sure you have to, because Bahaino is your chichu, the fact that the Mitzayra, right, is only putting in his thumb and in his toe, it's really also his ear, but Chazal don't focus on the ear. Shehem, they are only called biyah b'mikzas, and yet Vitanya, now here's the key. If you remember, we had 3 braises that we learned yesterday. We are focusing now on the 3rd one. Vitanya, we learned in braisa number 3, that Mitzayra toivel v'oimed b'shad niknar. Oh, and why is he toiveling? In order for him just to be allowed to put in his ear, thumb, and toe. Is araya, like we had at the end of, or on the top of the Amid, that even though it's only a midrabanan, all of the rules that apply to a tefillah doiraisa, this din chatzitza, all of the rules that ein adam nichnas lazara elim kain achayid boil applies even if his entry is only b'mixas. Okay, so now we concluded is speaking out the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, and again, just to quickly review, the big chiddush we had yesterday was that even though our Mishnah did not quote a machlekes, but we concluded that actually both Braisa 3 and even Braisa number 2 has a Rabbanan that argue with that. And they hold that if a person knows that they're tar, they don't have to go to the mikveh before they went inside the azara. So that is a very important machlekes tanoim. Now the Gemara here is going to focus on the Tana of our Mishnah. You can only enter the azara if you went to the mikveh, even if you think you're tar. So asks the Gemara, Elyahu, Mao sheyas sakin arucha v'yishchait. One theoretically is allowed to stand outside the azara and shecht a carbon as long as the carbon is kachekachem, is b'tzvayna mizbeach, kachekalim, anywhere in the azara. But the one who's doing the shechita can stand outside. And as we also learned, shechita is ksheira b'zar. Someone asked, some of the chevra that learn online with us wanted to know, shechita ksheira b'zar, is there any issue of the shoichet being a balmum? No, there's no rules of kahuna. You can be a balmum and you can shecht. What happens if someone has a knife that's very long, they are standing outside the azara, they're doing a shechita on a carbon. Does it bother us that they didn't go to the mikvah? In other words, is the going to the mikvah because you're doing the avodah, shechita, you're doing the avodah, you have to go to the mikvah? Or is the mikvah because you are entering the azara? You're not entering the azara. Or maybe there's a gezeri, you might enter, that's a gavaldik aboy. And the Gemara clarifies that this question, again, all of this is based on the Tana of our Mishnah, that everyone has to go to the mikveh prior to entry. But don't forget, we learned Ben Zoyma, so Tibaya le Ben Zoyma that explained that the Tefilla is Midairaisa, and even Tibaya le Rabbanan, the Pliga le de Rabbi Yehuda. Wow. And why does the Rabbanan that argue with the Rabbi Yehuda, this is the Braisa number 3, that only a Mitzayda must go to the mikveh. But other people who claim that they're tar, and they're not doyesh betuma, as we learned yesterday, they don't have to go to the mikveh. Maybe he will. Let's see both sides. So the Gemara explains. It's a din doiraisa. You have to go to the mikveh. No. Yeah, the mikveh, the limud, the kalvachayim is from the Kohen Gadol, but it's only to those who will enter the actual temple complex, right? Beginning with Ezras Yisrael, right? Beyond Shaniknar. Aval libbaroi, but if someone is standing outside, then no. Or even though I would even accept that the going to the mikveh is not about doing the avodah, it's about entering, But still, you can argue, you have to go to the mikvah nonetheless, because a person who is doing the shechita, what happens if the animal takes a step, to the right, a step to the left? You're running after the animal. The moment you're doing that, even you might be schlepped inside from the behemoth. So that's the boya according to Ben Zaymer. And tiboy l'Rabbanan, the pligale de Rabbi Yehuda, and they are so lenient. They say that only a mitzayra has to go to the mikvah. Doyesh betuma. But if a person knows that they're tired, they don't have to go. Maybe, says the Gemara now, that even that leaning into opinion, at kan le'kamri Rabbanan Hassan, that you can enter without going to the mikvah, other than the mitzayra, is only regarding someone, the loika avad avodah. That's about entering the azara, which would be us, Yisraelim. Aval hachi, but in our boya, even if it's a Yisraeli, but he's doing the shechita, that means he's doing the avodah, maybe even they will be moided that for the avodah, you have to go to the mikvah. Aval hachi dika avad avodah, then loy. Loy meaning that they won't be lenient. Yes, you will have to go to the mikvah. Oy dilma loishna, that they are lenient, that they hold that other than the mitzayra, if you know that you're tired, you never have to go to the mikvah. And the Gemara des says teikum. I just want to go back to what Rashi we learned yesterday, because when we learned that Rashi in the Mishnah said ein adam nichnas la'azara la'avoida, and Rashi wrote lav dafka. And really the question is, why lav dafka? It should be dafka lav. The way we learned the sugya until this baya, it should be, that's the way we learned it yesterday, that anyone who enters, not connected to the avoida, so why would the Mishnah say la avoida? Maybe Rashi writes lav dafke, we don't know for sure, because really that's the baya over here. In other words, maybe the Mishnah is saying ein adam nichnas lazara la avoida, right? And that unless you go to the mikvah. We said yesterday that there's a machlokes tanoim. What are we saying over here right now? Maybe there's no machlokes tanoim. Maybe the Tana that's lenient is only if you don't go to the avodah. If you go to the avodah, then everyone will agree that you have to go to the mikvah. So it's not clear, and then there's no more machlokes tanoim really. Now if our Mishnah only means la avodah, then there's not even a machlokes tanoim. That's why it's not clear how to touch the word avodah in the Mishnah. Okay, Bekitzer, the word says teku, which means we don't understand exactly, is it for the avodah, or is it for the entry, or even if it's only for the entry, maybe we will make a gzeda or not. Then the Gemara goes back to the Mishnah yesterday, chamesh tevilos va'asara kiddushim toivim.
I just have a quick question.
Sure.
In terms of the tefillah, what's the timeline on what is considered, because you say you're tired, I'm tired, that means maybe at some point I went to the mikvah. So what does it mean that you went to the mikvah before you entered? Is it right before?
People would go the day they entered. Okay, Chamesh Tvilos Vasara Kiddushin Toivel, so Tana Rabbanon, Chamesh Tvilos Vasara Kiddushin Toivel, Kohen Gadol Umekadesh, when Boy Bayom on Yom Kippur and Vikulan, from the 5 Tvilos, 4 out of the 5 are Bakodesh. In other words, it has to be in the mikvah, was in the location that has the Kedushas Hazara, which is Bebeis HaParva, as we learned. And really, it wasn't downstairs, but it was on the second story. Right? And we learned where was the second story? It was in the southern wall of the Azara, but it was sanctified with the Kedushas Azara. Chutz Midrash, other than the first Tefilla, which needed to be B'chayil, based on the rule that we just learned, no one can enter the Azara without going to the mikvah, so he had to go to the mikvah before he entered the Azara. And where was that B'chayil? It wasn't too far away. It was also, so to say, in the physical temple complex, but in the area that was not sanctified, B'kedushas Azara. And where was that mikvah? Al Gabe Sha'ar Hamayim, on top of the water gate. And as we learned above, it was also in the south, but that second story was not sanctified. And where was that mikvah? On top of Shara Mayim, which had the status of Choyel, Ubitzad Lishka Sehoisa. It was located on the side of the Lishka that the Kohen Gadol used, like we began this Masechta Lishkas Parhedrin. So Amar Abaye says, aha. So now that we are saying that there was a mikvah on top of Shara Hamayim, and he's focusing on Shara Mayim, the mikveh that was on top of Shara Parve. Just to look inside quickly, the 4th Tosfos in the Amid, the second line in Tosfos, the second line under the Gemara Tosfos says via Shleimer that Gag Beis HaParve was as high as the Karka Azara. It wasn't really that high up. We're not focusing on the Beis HaParve. But since we're saying that there was a mikvah on top of the water gate, and the water gate, we'll see, was at least 20 amos off the ground, it was on top, it was the second story. And how did they get the waters into the mikvah? Another important detail, that they did not get it the way we would get it from under the boir. They would get it by the water coming in over the walls of the mikvah. How high are the walls of the mikvah? We learned this so many times. The size in which a person can be fully submersed in water, 40 sa, will take up 1 amma by 3 ammas. So if you have a 20-story 20 amma building, and on top of it you place the mikvah, and on top of the wall the water came in, that means that the water is 23 ammas above the ground. Where is the water coming from? From a spring known as Ein Eitam. Wasn't right nearby, but it doesn't matter. Since the source of the spring is higher than 23 amas, that's why we were able to get the water inside. So from here we know that Ein Eitam, Gevaya Mekarka Azara, was higher than the floor of the Azara. Esre Mosholish Amas. It doesn't mean 23, it means a little bit more than 23. And quickly, if you look inside the Rashi, in middle of the Amid, Ein Eitam, Mimenu Ba'a Amas Hamayim. From Ein Eitam came the canal of water that went to the base of Tefilla that was on top of Shar Hamayim. That was the Tosfos that we learned. That ayah is not from the mikvah on top of Lishkas HaParva, because that Lishka, even though it was on the second story, it wasn't that much higher off the ground. Ulefi Ingen HaMikrois Niroli, Rashi says, where is Ein Eitam? That it's also known as the Mayan Mei Naftoyach. That's spoken about in Sefer Yoshua. Where is that? Shemisham HaGvul Mushpa V'yoyred L'Mizrach Olamayrav. There was some high point that is in the boundary of territory of Yehuda, territory of Binyamin. It's high because from both sides, from there it goes down, one side to Yehuda, one side to Binyamin. For who says Rashi, look inside the side, Hagovoya B'chol Eretz Yisrael. It's the highest point of Israel. And not only that, but he brings over here from Gemara Zvachim that David HaMelech was thinking of building the Beis HaMikdash in Eitan, because it's the highest point in Eretz Yisrael. And Fakert, he was told that since, like, for example, the Gemara quotes the pasuk in which Moshe Rabbeinu told Yosef that Ubenk Seifav Shachen. Benk Seifav means that in between the shoulders of the ox is where it should rest. The most beautiful part of the ox is between the shoulders, which is a little bit lower than the top of the head. No, it's the greatest beauty is not mamish the peak, but something a little bit underneath it. So they dafka did not build the Beis HaMikdash in Ein Eitam, but the water came from there. And now, so good. So since the water came from Ein Eitam, and now that we're telling me that there was a mikvah dafka on top of Shar Hamayim, so Abaya comes to the number 23. It's 23 plus. How do we get to 23? Because since the Tanan, it says in the Mishnah Midos, Kol Apsachim Shoyosham, all of the doorways that were over there in the temple complex had a height of 20 amma. So when you're building a second story, like how tall was the first story? You know it from the doorway, because you don't have a doorway that opens up to 2 stories. So we know the height of the first story from the Pesach, and all of the Pesachim had a height of 20 amma, and they had a width of 10 ammas. Aside of the Ulam, the empty chamber, as we learned in the first daf in Eruvin, right? That was double. That was 40. That was 20 ammas wide and 40 ammas tall. But forget about the Ulam. Every other gate, including in the Shar Hamayim. So number one, the first story went up 20 ammas. Now let's figure out how tall was the walls of the mikvah on the second story. So that we learned another V'tanya Abraisa, that when it says in Achrei Mos, right, Vayikra Tezvav, or in the end of in Mitzoira, when it says V'rachas B'tzorai B'mayim, just to know really the pasuk says V'rachas B'mayim Eskol B'tzorai. And we learned this just recently. It's not bimayim, but it's bamayim. There's a patach under the base. The difference is he should wash in water, bamayim in the water. The water is that for a mikveh, you have to have special waters. It can't be mayim she'uvim. So bamayim means b'mei mikveh. Mei mikveh means that the waters are gathered, but naturally, which is not so easy. And not that they were pre-gathered in a keli, rendering them into mayim she'uvim, even if they are then placed in a kosher mikvah, it's no longer kosher. That's from the patach, not the shva. When the pasuk says all of his flesh, kol b'sari, that's the source, that mayim, how much water has to be in a mikvah, shekol gufei oila behem, that the entire body fits in it at one time. And how much is that? V'kama hein, really we know the words are 40 sa, but now the Braisa gives you the dimension of the boir. And what's the dimensions? Ama alama. Think about it, when you stand, Pasha Amma Lama is a size of an average of many tiles. I know in the Shul Bayas, the tiles are 1 Amma by 1 Amma, and that's how much space you take up comfortably. It means if you were to have, it won't be such a comfortable mikvah, but just imagine it's 1 Amma, it's 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet, on the height of 4.5 feet. Now the walls will have to be even taller. I'm just thinking about that because how would you get in there? Or maybe 3 Ammas is. We can bend down in there. The walls are 3 amas tall. It's not more than that. So since the Mishnah Braisa says it's amal amma berum gimel amois, and v'shiarach hachamim mikvar b'im sa, but bottom line is, if the bottom story is 20 amas tall, on the second story you had the walls of the mikvah. And again, the waters are not coming in from the sides. They didn't have those mechanisms, and the water would seep out. The water came in from the top. So the water entered the mikvah on top of Sharamayim, 23 amas above the floor of the Azara. How did the waters get in there? That's the raya that Ein Eitam, if you want to find where it is, look at the topography of the Holy Land, find a location that's a little bit more than 23 amas above the height of Harabayis, of Shar Azara, of the Azara. That is Ein Eitam. Daf Lamed Aleph Amid Beis.
The height of the mikvah, 3 amas, that's... The idea is that the Kohen Gadol needs to be able to stand up in the mikvah?
Well, the Kohen Gadol has to get in the mikvah. He's not. I'm just at 3 amas. I think we're taller than 3 amas. We're exactly yet, but you can bend down.
If you go by the bigger measurement of 2 feet,
then it fits. Then he would bend down a little bit. Correct.
But the idea is that he stands up.
Doesn't have to stand up. He just has to be submerged under the water. He'll bend down the way a woman needs. That's a position that the Chazal speak about going to the mikvah. That will work. There's enough an am and an am unless he's very obese to fit down that way.
Well, but they didn't have to have it so narrow. Just that's the minimum shiur, right? It could have been.
So Danny is saying you can challenge the whole thing over here. Maybe the mikvah was much wider, and therefore was much shorter. That's a good, and that would answer. Here you go, Kevin, with his pictures. But 1 second. But the Gemara asks a question that you're making up. If we're going on the premise that the walls of the mikvah are 3 amas tall, we got ourselves a problem. And what is our problem? That you Bechlal did not take into account the thickness of the ceiling and the floor of the second story. And especially when you built a platform for water, you have to make it thick for 2 reasons: to hold the weight and for the water not to seep out. So the Gemara asks on top of the amit, the cheshbon normally will be an amma for the tikra. The thickness of the ceiling should be 1 amma, and aside of that, another amma for the ma'aziva. The ma'aziva, we're speaking here again about let's speak about the concrete pavement that will be placed under the mikveh itself, right? So Abaye should have come to 25 amas. So answers the Gemara, Sha'arim the Beis HaMikdash, that all of these doorways, since Kiven the Sheisha Nino, since they were made out of marble, now marble has both advantages. Number 1, marble is not porous. So if you're worried about seepage, it won't seep out. Marble is very strong, it's stone. So you don't have to make it thick. So it was much thinner. It took up space, but not an amma and an amma. Since the sheisha b'mashu of it was mashu. Now the Gemara is going to ask, well, v'ha'ika ha'ach mashu. You can't ignore that mashu. So for that, the Gemara answers, kiven delo yahava amsa. Since both the ceiling and the platform under the mikvah together was less than an amma, so that's a normal rule. We round it off. In our case, we round it off to a lower number, and loy chashiv lahu. But the one thing is important to remember is that Abaye is not really saying that Ein Itam is 23 amas. Abaye is saying that the Ein Itam was 23 amas and a bit more. Now we're saying it was 23 and a bit. Because the walls to begin with of the top of the mikvah were already more than 23 amas, and the Ein Itam needed to be even higher than that. Okay, the ending, going back to the last line of the Mishnah, Perisu Sadan Shalbutz. Now we explained that every time the Kohen Gadol would go to the mikveh, if many people were around, for modesty, they would spread out some sort of sheet. The emphasis of the Mishnah is, as we segue back to the Avodah of Yom Kippur, is what type of sheet was spread out, butz, meaning of linen. Now, why did they dafka spread out shalbutz? So that is just like Rav Huna said elsewhere. In the following Mishnah, on the Mishnah Daf Lamed Hey, that on Yom Kippur they made a point to use dafka linen, kadeshi yakir, for everyone to remember, for it to be clear. Everyone should realize that what is unique about Yom Kippur is that the Kohen Gadol, which normally would have to wear his shmeine begadim, which are many times called big day zahav. It's not that they were all made out of gold, but they all had gold in it. Right? Hachinami, and on Yom Kippur it's only big day lovin, so they dafka hachinami, they dafka used a sadin shalbutz sheyakid, for it to be clear, for people to realize that today is special, how sha'avodas hayoim is done with the most humblest of clothing, with big day boots. And also, al pi chasidus, linen is connected to gevura, and the avodah normally of a kohen is an avodah of chesed. But on the other hand, Yom Kippur is the concept of tshuva. The tshuva is the concept of tshuva is milmato lomayla, which is the concept of gevura. Okay, Chavre, we're going mamish through the Seder of Yom Kippur. Now the Kohen Gadol, as we'll start developing more in the sugya, we already mentioned he went to the mikvah 5 times. The Kohen Gadol didn't only do the special, unique avodah for Yom Kippur, but we're going with the Shitas Bal Hamoyer, that everything on Yom Kippur was done by the Kohen Gadol. And what did we learn previously? That the Shechita, right? The Shechita was the avodah that's going to be done by whoever won the Shochet. There's not going to be a pious on Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol is going to do the Shechita, prior to which he has to go to the mikvah. Now the Shechita was the Shechita of the morning Tamid, for which he didn't wear his big day lovin yet, because any avodah that the Kohen Gadol did, which is similar to every other day's avodah, which is the Tamid, which is the and with the Nesachim, which is the Ketaitis, which is the Menorah, he would wear the big day Zahav. He would only have to put on the big day lovin when he began to do the avodah that was unique to Yom Kippur. Now he comes in from Parhedrin wearing his big day chayil. So the first thing is Pashat, he has to remove his mundane clothing. Yarad v'taval, and he goes to the mikveh. Now what did not happen here is he was not mekadosh his hands and his feet, even though the klal normally is that every mikveh had a kiddush, sanctification prior and post, not the first one. Why is that? Because he's not getting undressed from Big Day Kodesh. He's undressing Big Day Chayil. And we'll see that this is indeed the machlokes Rav Meir and the Chachamim, whether the first kiddush was about what you are removing or it's about what you're going to get dressed into. And we're going with the approach that the first time you wash his hands and his feet is because he's removing Big Day Kodesh, but the first time he's not removing Big Day Kodesh. So he doesn't have to sanctify his hands and his feet. He undresses himself, he goes down, even though we just said the mikvah was high up. Doesn't matter. The wall was 23 amos off the ground, but then how does he get down? You go down, and it's very significant that we always use the words going down, because mikvah's bittul means you have to go down, put your ego down. And v'taval, that's tefillah.
Maybe there were stairs.
Yeah, going down can be through stairs, but he went down. The point is that don't say the mikvah was up. No, he went down into the mikvah, and v'taval. Allah, he goes up, v'nistapag, and he dried himself. Now the drying himself, Rashi writes in the Mishnah, is very important. First of all, misativ ba'alointis, he would wrap himself in a large towel, shel beged, lispek maim shal b'sarei, to get rid of all of the excess water still on his body. V'nistapag, v'niskaneach. Now v'niskaneach, just to know, is a lashon of wiping clean. L'cho'ura, that's not a lashon that's used to get rid of the water. Lav dafka, water would be a chatzitza between the begadim and his garments, but it could be that in the water itself there might be some residue of dirt, which is a whole topic here in the Rishonim. So he would have to dry off the water to make sure that if there is any granule of sand or some other impurity on his body, he got rid of it, because there was not allowed to be a chatzitza between his garments and the body. Okay, so now Heviyolei Big Day Zahav. Now they bring him the golden garments, and he gets dressed. The golden garments are the Shmoni Big Day Kahuna. According to Rav Meir and the Chachamim, whose opinions will clarify more in a moment, L'kula Alma, the second kiddush was done after he was dressed. That's according to everyone. After he's dressed, now Vikidesh, he would sanctify Yadav Viraglov. And the Mishnah is Meduyak again. The Mishnah Dafke does not say that there was a Kiddush before he went to the mikvah, because our Tana holds that before the first mikvah, there was not a sanctification. I mean, we do have a problem. The problem will be is that how did we have 10 sanctifications? Was if every time he went to the mikvah, there was a Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim before and after, 5 Tefillas, 10 Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. The Mishnah is clearly holding, and that's the din. Our Tana holds that there is no Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim prior to the first mikvah. So you're going to be missing one act of Kiddush. We'll get to that later. They brought him the animal, the carbon tamid. And unlike the kohen that normally would do it, or even the Yisrael that would make the shechita perfectly, that means he would cut not only the minimum amount needed, which is the majority of the two pipes, but he would cut them completely, not the kohen gadol on Yom Kippur. Because during the year, the shoichet was not the mekabel. That's what we established. The mekabel was the zoydik. So I can shecht and you can be mekabel. I can do my job properly and you can do your job properly. Your job was to get all of the lifeblood. The kohen gadol did the shechit and did the kabbalah. How do you do that? The moment you start shechting, I mean, yeah, for a second, for a millisecond, there's only a little bit of blood, but then the lifeblood begins to spurt out. That lachatchila, all of that should be captured in a mizrak. So the kohen dafke did not complete the shechita. He completed it halachically. So karatzi means that he made an incision severing the majority of both the trachea and the esophagus. More than that, he right away stopped. Another kohen completed the shechita for him on his behalf. The other guy is not a kohen gadol. He did the avodah. The shechita is already kosher. We just don't want the shechita to be kosher b'di'evet, so the other person made it into a lachatchila. Now this is a very tricky thing because you can't stop in the middle of a shechita. So your mamash have to know how to shecht, and as your knife is moving, another kohen took over the knife. And he right away then was mekabel the dam. Another thing, the avodah has to always be done with the right hand. So you can't shecht with one hand and be mekabel with the left hand. It doesn't work that way. He shechted with the right hand and he was mekabel the dam in the mizrak that he held in his right hand. Kibel asadam, he was the one that was mekabel the dam. The Mishnah doesn't say that he needed to walk into the mizbeach because he could be standing near the mizbeach. We learned this in Zvachim. Hoylach is not an essential avodah. If a hoylacha has to happen, then it has to happen through a kohen. If a hoylacha happens and you have a machshavas chutz l'zman, chutz l'makim, you will passel the carbon, but you don't have to have hoylacha, at least according to some opinions. Okay, next. Now he's continuing to do the daily regular avodah. Regular avodah means nichnas lahakter ketayros, which was done daily shol shachar, and then uleheitev esaneiros, which is done every morning, aside of Shita Sarambam, who holds that they lit them and later every morning. Everyone else, the Rashban, everyone else holds no. Hatev means that they only prepared the lamps, as we spoke out before. They would clear out the lamps. And then he went back, he would, the kohen gadol would be the one bringing up the head and the limbs. Machlokes Rishonim, whether the kohen gadol did all of the steps that we learned. Remember, by the Koren Publisher, there was really a total of 5 or 6 steps if you count the kirbayim. Here the Mishnah is only speaking about the head and the limbs. Okay. And then the chavitin, because aside of the flour from the nesachim of the mincha, you have the chavitin kohen gadol and yayin. Yayin normally would be the 13th kibud, the 13th chuz that was given out on a daily basis. Now the Mishnah points out for a moment, we're just digressing to show the difference between when ketayros was brought by the morning tamid versus ketayros in the afternoon. Ketayros shal shachar, as we just mentioned, was brought bing dam le'evarim. Right? No evarim were burnt prior to the ketayros. However, shal bein harbayim, in the afternoon, not only did they shecht it first, they actually brought up and threw on the fire all of the evarim, and only then did they do the ketayros. But even in the afternoon, the ketayros was an in-between. It was in between the evarim and the nesachim. The nesachim here doesn't only mean the wine, the nesachim also means the flour. Okay, that's just a digression. We're coming back to Yom Kippur. Now the kohen gadol is going to have to change his garments. He's going to have to, this will be now his first tefillah that's going to be b'kodesh. He's going to start doing the avodah lifnim, v'lifnai v'lifnim. So says the Mishnah that im hoya kohen gadol zaken, if he was an older person, or istanis, or if he was a very delicate person in nature, and therefore going into cold water would be difficult for him. It's interesting. Machamin loichamin. Okay, this can go back even to the first one. They would warm up water. Obviously, guys, not on Yom Kippur, God forbid. They would warm up water prior to Yom Kippur. That was the best they got in a warm mikvah. And they would throw the hot water in the cold water in order, right, to lose some of the chill of the water. Okay, says the Gemara. We're going to focus on the Pashat, Yorad V'Tavel, Olav, and Estapog. People are familiar with these words that we use continuously through the Musaf of Yom Kippur. Amrua Rabbanan, these Rabbanan are Amirayim. There are students sitting in front of the great Rav Papa, and when they learned this Mishnah, they suggested to their teacher that it comes out, the Loi Rabbi Meir. This Mishnah cannot follow Rabbi Meir. What's Pshat? Let's read inside the Rashi. If you see the Rashi, 4 lines under the Gemara. The Loi Rabbi Meir. The palig b'masnisen b'tfila shniya aderabanan shahoya magdimin kiddush lipshita. The Chachamim hold that when is he mekadesh his yodayim prior to the mikvah? He is mekadesh it before he takes up his garments. Kiddush yodayim v'raglayim, taking off garments, etc. V'hu, I'm reading inside the Rashi, that's Rav Meir holds, no, higdim pshita lekiddush, that the Kiddush yodayim v'raglayim that one does prior to the mikvah is after you are unclothed. Now, l'cho'ura, what's the difference? L'cho'ura, Rav Meir holds that, why doesn't he say you wash your hands to remove your garments? Because he holds that the Kiddush yodayim v'raglayim prior mikvah is not connected to the removing of the clothes. If not, you would wash your hands before you remove your clothes. Rav Meir holds that you wash your hands and your feet in order to put on the new garments. Elama, you don't do that once, you do that twice. You're mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim prior to the mikvah. You're mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim after you got dressed. But the Chachamim understand that Rav Meir holds that the washing of the hands and the feet is never about the past, it's only about the future. It's not about the removal of, it's about the putting on. Now that's very significant. Why is that very significant? Because if that's the understanding in Rabbi Meir, then Rabbi Meir will hold that even in the first mikvah, he needed to be mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim twice. Which is not what our Mishnah says. Our Mishnah doesn't mention the Kiddush yadayim v'raglayim prior to the first mikvah. Our Mishnah mentions the first Kiddush yadayim v'raglayim only after he got dressed with the big day Zahav. After he got dressed with the Shmoyne Begadim. So the Chachamim who understood that the reason why Rabbi Meir holds that the Kohen would be mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim after he got undressed, not prior, is because the Kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, both of them are connected to putting on the new garments, while the Kohen Gadol here is putting on big day Zav. So according to Rabbi Meir, he should have to be mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim twice, connected to the first tefillah, one prior and one post. He's undressing big day chayil. So what? It's not connected to the big day chayil. It's not connected to the clothing that you are removing, because according to Rabbi Meir, you only wash your hands after you remove your clothing. To eat Rabbi Meir, Kivin the Amr, since Rabbi Meir holds, that's the way they understood Rav Meir, that Rei Kiddusha, that both Kiddushim concerning the mikvah are never about, none of them are about the clothing that you remove, but alavisha of it, it's about what you're getting dressed into. So Hachinami, Rav Meir will hold, even regarding the first mikvah, doesn't matter that the first tefillah was done by choil. Nami li'avet rei kiddusha, he should be mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim twice, because he's going to be dressing big days of. Simple. Okay, so in other words, our Mishnah is not Rabbi Meir. Amalu Rav Papa, so Rav Papa tells his Talmidim, tells the Rabbanan, and I disagree with you. Yeah, no one is debating that Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim argue when was the Kohen mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim. The Chachamim hold, first sanctify your hands and your feet, then take off the garments, then go to the mikvah, get up, get dried, get dressed again, and be mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim again. No one debates that. I'm saying no one debates again that the kiddush happened at the end, after you got dressed. Rabbi Meir also holds no debate about Rav Meir. Rav Meir holds that first you got undressed, then you were mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim, then you went to the mikvah, then you got up, then you got dried, then you got dressed, and then you washed your hands in again. But don't understand that the reason why Rabbi Meir holds that you are mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim after you got undressed is because Rav Meir holds it's connected to the new levisha, it's connected to the future. No, says Rav Papa. Bein Rav Meir, bein Rabban, bein Rav Meir. The first Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim is connected to the removal. It's connected to the removal. And since back in our Mishnah, the Kohen Gadol begins with Big Day Chol, it doesn't make sense that any Tana will hold that you have to be Mekadosh Yadayim V'Raglayim for the removal of Big Day Chol. Big Day Chol doesn't justify a Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. Chad Apshita, the Big Day Kodesh, Chad Alavisha. And so why does Rav Meir say that you only wash your hands after you get undressed? It's a machlokes, and how do you learn Pshat and Psukim? That when it says, guys, I'm opening up a Chumash Achrei Mois, which is Vayikra Tez Zayin, and I'm going to read Pasik Chav Gimel. And the Pasik reads, Ubo ha'aron aloy moed. Ufashat is Big Day Abad. Now we are already a little bit later in the day, but that's where it says clearly. He would get undressed with the linen garments, the ones that he wore when he went into the holy, and v'hini chamsham, that we already touched v'hini chamsham, and on Pasuk Chav Daled, v'rachatz es besarei b'mayim, he would wash his flesh in water, b'makim kadosh. Washing, v'rachatz, does not mean mikvah. V'rachatz means kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. That's the source. And then he would get dressed. V'lavash es begadav. So let's read it inside. Ufashat, v'rachatz, v'lavash. Now if you can see in the parentheses, there's another v'rachatz. In the Chumash there's one v'rachatz. But we have a halacha l'Moshe Messinai that he washes his hands twice. So we know v'rachatz means once and twice. The only question is when. So Rav Meir holds that makish pshita l'levisha, that we compare the sanctification, not the sanctification connected to the removal, to the sanctification connected to the putting on the new garments. Just like when it comes to putting on the new garments. Everyone holds. First, the Kohen put on the new garments. And on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol put on the new garments. And then he was Mekadesh. You only did Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim after you put on your garments. So since the Torah says, Upashat v'lavash, make a hekesh, af pshita, first pashat, and then Mekadesh. In other words, I know, by getting dressed, first get dressed and then wash your hands. First get undressed and then be Mekadesh Yadayim V'Raglayim. The Rabbanan hold. They also agree that there's a hekish. Savri makish pshita l'levisha, but in a different way. Ma levisha, the second washing was while you are already garbed. Lavish Mekadesh. So af pshita, kishahu lavish Mekadesh. So no one is debating that they argue. We know what Rav Meir holds. The question is, why does Rav Meir hold what he holds? And Rav Papa rejected the svara of his Talmidim, of the Rabbanan, and therefore Rav Papa is suggesting that even Rav Meir will agree with the Tana of our Mishnah. Which is, that's the question here. When it came to the first time that the Kohen Gadol went to the mikvah, was there 2 times, 2 sanctifications, or only 1? So says the Gemara that Amalei Rabbanan Rav Papa, you're wrong. You're wrong because the Braisa says clearly, unlike you, Umi matzis amritachi, that Rav Meir doesn't require, that Rav Meir does not require to kiddushim for the first mikvah. No, V'atanya, it says in a Braisa, Periscope sadan shalbutz, that when they would put on, when they would spread out this linen sheet, beinoi lebein ha'am. This is the first time he went to the mikvah. On top of Beis HaParveh. Pashat, listen to the words. Pashat, he took off his garments. V'yarad, he went down into the mikveh. He toiveled, he went up. V'nestapik, he dried himself. They brought him big day zav. He got dressed. Kiddush Yadav V'Raglav, mamish like our Mishnah. And explicitly, Rav Meir says, no, you skipped a step. You skipped the first sanctification. Pashat, he garbed himself. Kiddush Yadav V'Raglav, that's the first kiddush. V'yarad v'taval olav v'nestapa kiviyolei big day zav olavish v'kiddush Yadav V'Raglav befedish, according to Rav Meir, there were 2 Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, and therefore, yes, Rabbi Meir argues with our Mishnah. And to the point that Rav Papa right away gave in. Rav Papa says, listen, I never knew of that Braisa. Itanya, indeed Tanya. And we just clarified that the reason why Rav Meir holds, it's more than the hekish, that the Kohen would wash his hands only after he took off his old garments. That's because he holds that you sanctify your hands because of the garments that you will be putting on. And it's not about the garments that you are removing. The Chachamim hold that you have to be mekadosh your hands, both for the removal of the garments and for the putting on for the garments. And let's just close this sugya. So now, like we spoke out when we learned the Mishnah, according to Rav Meir, you're going to have 10 Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, because we have 5 mikvahs, as we'll learn, God willing, in tomorrow's share. Everyone, including the first one, had a sanctification prior and post, so that's 10. So Bishlam el Rav Meir, Hainu Mishkachas, Daf Lamed Beis on the top of Kiddushin, El Rabbanon. You went to the mikvah 5 times, but our Mishnah writes, and again, the Braisa says, that the Chachamim hold that when it comes to the first mikvah, prior to the first mikvah, there was no sanctification. So, bazoi, you only have 9 kiddushin. So they give a gewaldige answer. Again, the Rabbanan hold l'shitasam that you are mekadesh yadayim v'raglayim connected to the clothing that you are taking off. So it's not really about going to the mikvah. So when the Kohen Gadol finished the entire avodah of Yom Kippur and he took off his big days off to go home, according to Rav Meir, he would not have to wash his hands and feet because he's not going to get dressed in a new big day kodesh. But according to the Chachamim Amri Lach Rabbanan, that Kiddusha Basra, you know when did we have the 10th? Ki Pashat big day kodesh, Lil V'Lavish big day Chayil Avid Lei Hasam. He would do it over there. Everyone l'shitasam. So everyone subscribes 5 mikvahs, 10 Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. The question is, regarding the 10th, the Chachamim hold it was at the end of everything, and Rav Meir will hold that it was in the beginning of the Avodah, meaning, the beginning means that he would take off his big day chayil, he would be Mekadesh Yadayim V'Raglayim, and then he would go to the mikvah, etc., God willing, to be continued. If someone can press that button over there, that would be great.